In this podcast 1.6, we're going to be discussing the deductive fallacies. Before we do that, however, we need to talk about what fallacies are in general. Fallacies are errors in reasoning that happen so regularly that we have to pick them out for special consideration. There are two kinds of fallacies. First, there are those that occur only in deductive form, and then there are those that occur in both deductive and inductive form. In this podcast, I'm only going to be talking about the deductive fallacies. Deductive fallacies happen as a result of misidentifying invalid forms as valid forms. The two most common deductive fallacies are what's called denying the antecedent and affirming the consequent. This should look fairly familiar to you from the last podcast where we talked about affirming the antecedent and denying the consequent. Well, notice that's not matching up to what we talked about in last podcast, what we see here, and that's why these two particular forms are actually going to be fallacious. Let's take a look at the form of the first one, denying the antecedent. Premise 1, if P then Q. Premise 2, not P. Conclusion, therefore not Q. What's being denied here is the antecedent of the hypothetical statement in premise 1. What we saw earlier was denying the consequent, where Q would have been denied, or affirming the antecedent, where P would have been affirmed. Here, what's happening is P is being denied, and then the conclusion is supposed to be what's supposed to follow is not Q. Now, if this form are valid, then we could, upon assuming the premises are true, never be able to find a false conclusion. So what we need to determine here is whether there are any cases where we can put true statements in for the premises and still result in a false conclusion. So notice this example. Premise 1, if Rex is a human, then Rex is a mammal. Premise 2, Rex is not a human, therefore, conclusion, therefore Rex is not a mammal. Now if we make premises 1 and 2 true, it should be, if this were a valid form, that the conclusion could not be false. That is, if premises 1 and 2 are true, then it would have to be the case that Rex is not a mammal. But notice what happens. We can say premise 1 is true, because all humans are actually mammals, and we can pick a particular creature named Rex that's not a human, but notice that we actually discover that Rex, while not a human, is actually a dog, and dogs are mammals. So this particular form of inference is invalid and therefore a fallacy. The second deductive fallacy is what's called affirming the consequent. The form here is seen in the following. Premise 1, if P then Q. Premise 2, Q. Conclusion, therefore P. And remember that in the last podcast we saw either P being affirmed and Q following, or Q being denied and not P following. Here what the person's trying to get us to accept is that from the mere fact that Q follows, or Q is true, and if P then Q is true, P follows. But again, we can look at an example. If I am a cat, then I am a mammal. True. I am a mammal. True. Therefore, I'm a cat. Not true. Since it's possible to come up with a false conclusion here from true premises, we can see that this is an invalid form, and therefore any argument that takes this form is a fallacy.